Another Sunday morning, and I want to just call your attention to St. Matthew chapter 13 and verse 53. St. Matthew chapter 13 and start reading at verse 53. Verse 53 reads, "And it came to pass that when Jesus had finished these parables, he departed thence." Verse 54 said, "And when he was come into his own country, he taught them in their synagogue, insomuch that they were astonished, and said, Whence has this man this wisdom and these mighty works?" 55 says, "Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary, and his brother James, and Hosea, and Simon, and Judas?" 56 said, "And his sisters, are they not all with us? Whence then has this man all these things?" Verse 57 said, "And they were offended in him. But Jesus said unto them, A prophet is not without honor, save in his own country and in his own house." 58, "And he did not many works there because of their unbelief." I want to call your attention to that 58th verse. "And he did not many mighty works there because of their unbelief." Just a simple thought today, because of their unbelief. And once again, we are studying, and the only goal is to learn more about Jesus and other things according to this Bible that will help us to grow and to grow in strength and in faith. And those types of growth, that type of growth is what will give us inspiration. We've talked about it on many times before. We've discussed some of the things that God had done in order to meet this goal or reach this plan that he had set forth from the foundation of the world. And of course, we know that this now is the New Testament, and we've gone past the Old Testament, and we passed through between the testaments. And if you've done any type of studying at all, you have to realize that there was things that happened at the close of the Old Testament that's not made record in the New Testament. In other words, when we pass from the Old Testament and we enter into the New Testament, we find that the situations have changed quite a bit. And you know, God had sent a many in the Old Testament, and they had come and they had done their job, and they had gone on to be with the Lord. But even at the end of the Old Testament, and the children of Israel had found themselves, I want to put it like this, maybe in their rightful place as a people. But what you have to realize is that with the children of Israel, it was a physical condition. The place that they found themselves in was a physical condition, but God's intent was that they would go past that physical condition. In other words, they would get that promised land. They would get that rightful place according to God's will for them. But in spite of that, or in addition to that, God wanted to help them to develop spiritually. He wanted them to have something more than something physical, because physical things, they come and go. But God not only wanted Israel to achieve a spiritual growth, but he wanted everybody else. In other words, this spiritual growth and this prosperity in spirit would go beyond the children of Israel, and it would extend to everybody else. So then, God had a plan. And this Bible, it's just ongoing. There's an ongoing scenario, and it began from before the foundation of the world, and that plan is taken on to the New Testament, and we have gone through that 400 years between the Testament. And when we start this lesson, you will notice that everything is changed. The Roman Empire and many things like that is now in place, because Jesus had to go before Pontius Pilate and some of these other people that we really didn't learn about in the Old Testament, but between the New Testament and the Old Testament, and I don't talk about it too much because his historical in nature, his secular in nature, and a lot of things that we might learn to help us get from the Old Testament to the New Testament, you'll find them in history books and so many other ways that we learn about those things. But the first thing that we learn in the Old Testament is what we talked about some already, that Jesus, when we first started, is on the way. Jesus is another, I would say, way that God is bringing this plan together. We saw so many others that have come along, and they did what they could, and they died, and they received their reward from God. But the Bible lets us know that there's still hope. And that hope is in Jesus. So then, if we would look at our lesson today, it says, and it came to pass. Now, first of all, when Jesus had finished these parables, he departed. Now, first of all, we can see that Jesus is on the scene. He's come down from heaven, and he before he came down from heaven, there was information that was given to the people at that time, even though they were under Roman rule, and they had Pharisees and Sadducees, and they had scribes and all these different types of people. They were already on the scene, and they had been writing, and they had established certain types of governments, And all these things that Jesus would come into this world, and once Jesus came into the world, he would have to deal with those things. And what am I saying? God has placed us here. We are here to do God's will, but first of all, doing God's will means that we are going to have to face things in life that we didn't really understand or really know that we would have to face in life, but yet and still we would have to face them. And when Jesus came, Jesus, he knew that he would face things in life. We might be surprised, but Jesus was not surprised, but preparations had been made that would help people understand that when Jesus comes, that he would come and make a difference in life. If we go back and just look at St. Matthew chapter 11, in verse 1, it says, "And it came to pass when Jesus had made an end of his commanding his 12 disciples." In other words, Jesus had done quite a few things at the time, and I say this all the time, it's impossible to discuss everything that Jesus had done, because we had a Sermon on the Mountain, and we had so many other things that Jesus had done. And so John the Baptist, in verse 1, it says, "It came to pass when Jesus had made an end of commanding his 12 disciples, he departed then to teach and to preach in their cities." In chapter 11, he says, verse 2 says, "Now when John had heard in prison," in other words, Jesus was on the scene. He had been born of the Virgin Mary, and Jesus had been around. And of course, Jesus was a pretty common name, but yet and still Jesus was more than just the name Jesus, but he was Christ. He was the salvation of the world. He was the Messiah. And when Jesus came, he came doing the will of God. And if you would look at chapter 11 of Matthew, he says, "Now when John had heard in prison the works of Christ," and see, in other words, he had done many things. He came in order to do God's will, and he came running and willing and able to do God's will. So John had heard of some of these things that he had done. So John had been cast into prison. And we know he had been cast into prison because he was telling the truth. He had told Herod the truth about Herod's why he had told him, it's not, you shouldn't, this is not right for you to do that. So they cast him in prison, and while he was in prison, he heard about Jesus, because if you will remember, he was out preaching the gospel, and he was telling the people that, that a Savior was coming, and John made sure that while he was telling the people that a Savior was coming, he was making sure that he wasn't talking about himself. He wasn't lifting himself up, but he was always making sure that he kept himself humble. He made sure he kept himself humble and helped them to understand that there's a Savior coming. There's one coming. and the one that's coming, he's more than I am. He was letting them know this person is not just anybody, but he's the Christ, he's the Savior that you've been looking for. So then he says he sent two of his disciples and said unto him, art thou he, in verse 3, that should come, or do we look for another? You know, he pretty much asks a rhetorical question because he realized that Jesus was coming and there was no one else to come. So then the question is, when Jesus is not enough, or when Jesus is less than what we think he should be, who do we turn to? What do we have to lean on? And you know, sometimes it seems though we put us, or we put ourselves higher than what Jesus is. I will understand. Seemingly, sometimes we put our understanding over the understanding or the teaching of Jesus. And you might understand I'm saying this because of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes and so many others that Jesus had already gone through here teaching and preaching, and he did the Sermon on the Mountain, and he had been teaching and preaching and showing these great works. And yet and still at times he ran into people that had been around him. They had heard him teaching, and they had heard him preaching, and had seen the mighty works that Jesus had done, and yet and still, you know, some people still want to act like that they are better than Jesus, or no better than Jesus himself. So then, but John says, verse 4, in verse 3, and said unto him, art thou he that should come, or do we look for another? John wanted to ask that question, but yet and still he was rhetorical because he knew that no one else was able to come and give sight to the blind. No one else was able to come and teach the things that Jesus was able to teach. In other words, he was trying to establish the rightful place of Jesus, because some even began to look at John the Baptist as they do today. Sometimes people began to look at other people and they take their eyes off of Christ. So then he says, Jesus answered and said unto him in verse 4, go and show John again these things which do ye hear and see. In other words, go back and remind and show him the evidence of the things that you have heard and the things that you've seen. And he says in verse 5, the blind receive their sight, and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. He says in verse 6, and blessed is he whosoever shall not be offended in me. So then, you know, Jesus, he made this tribute to John the Baptist, but he, at the same time, he made it clear. He openly expressed the fact that no other man was able to do these things. And we've said it before. You know, many had come, They did the best they could, but there were certain things they were not able to do. So in our text today, it says, and it came to pass when Jesus had finished these parables. In other words, he was teaching and he was preaching and he was telling people about things that they wouldn't know, wouldn't be able to know unless it came from Jesus. And he said, and he departed thence. Verse 54 said, and when he was coming to his own country. In other words, Jesus, when he came into his own country and he taught them in their synagogue. Verse 54, insomuch that they were astonished and said, when has this man this wisdom and these mighty works? In other words, they had seen the things that Jesus was doing. They had heard the things that Jesus was talking about. And Jesus had done these things in other places. And they had heard about those things, but yet when he came to his own people and to his own country, 55 says, is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And his brother James and Jose and Simon and Judas and his sister, are they not all with us? Whence then has this man all these things? In other words, they are seeing what Jesus is doing. They are hearing what he's saying, and they can only see as far as what their faith would allow them. Because their faith right now is not in their belief that a Savior was coming. In other words, Jesus had been introduced by John, and they had been told that a Savior was coming into the world, but because they could only see further than their physical thoughts, that this man Jesus had already been around. He had been born to Mary. His father was a carpenter. His sisters and other relatives were all around there. But yet and still, Jesus is saying all of these things. So in verse 57, and they were offended in him. In other words, how could this be? How could this be this Jesus, this Savior? And Christ, he knew that they would be wondering those things. So then he says, a prophet is not without honor except in his own country and his own house. And verse 58, he said, and he did not many works, therefore, because of their unbelief. All I was trying to do here is help us to understand from this lesson today, in spite of what we want to do in life, the first thing we have to do is we have to believe in Jesus. You know, we can't do anything. The Bible says it's impossible to please God without faith. We have to have faith in order to please God. And even Jesus Christ, when he came into this world, he came to do God's will, but he did it according to his faith in God, because you have to remember when Jesus was hanging on Calvary cross and Jesus was getting ready to die on Calvary cross, and they had hung him high and stretched him wide, and Jesus had been hanging on Calvary cross. You know, and they were trying to convince Jesus that if he was the Savior, if he was who he was, then they wanted him to come down from the cross, save himself and save them too. But Jesus refused to come down from the cross because Jesus, he knew that he had to go to Calvary cross in order to die, to be a Savior for the entire world. But yet and still, in this introduction to today, we have to see how important faith is going to be, not worrying about Jesus and his faith, but how important it is for us to have faith in God in spite of, we said it before, God will send somebody, and I'm going to put it like this right now. We are seeing right now out in the world where people have so much faith in certain people, and it's based on the people. But you have to have faith in God. You have to trust in God. And God will be able to help us. And right here, God couldn't do anything for them because they had no faith in him. And that's all I wanted to get out today is we have to have faith in Jesus. And when we have faith in Jesus, we will be able to do God's will